The city presents in microcosm all the contrasts of our modern life, its worst and its best aspects. Here are the broad avenues, and here the fetid streets whose festering filth pollutes the atmosphere. Here, palaces, on which self-extravagance has lavished every artifice for luxury and display. And here, tenements, where in defiance of every law, moral and sanitary, men, women and children are crowded together like maggots in a cheese. Here are the noblest men and women, putting forth the most consecrated energies in self-sacrificing labors for the redemption of their fellow men. Appalled, but not discouraged by the immensity of the problem which confronts them. And here, the most hopeless specimens of degraded humanity, in whom, so far as human sight can see, the last spark of divinity has been quenched forever. What shall we do with our great cities? What will our great cities do with us? These are the two problems which confront every thoughtful American. The Reverend Lyman Abbott, Plymouth Church, Brooklyn, New York.
When one is inclined to despair of the country, let him go to the Central Park on a Saturday and spend a few hours there looking at the people, not those who come in gorgeous carriages, but those who arrive on foot or in those exceedingly democratic conveyances, the streetcars. New York Herald.
In the summer of 1865, as 4 long years of civil war came to an end, Frederick Law Olmsted returned to New York and resumed work on the great park he had begun 8 years before. One of his first acts was to commission a special memorial to the Union naval dead. 8 years later, the statue was complete. Rising above the Bethesda Fountain, at the very heart of the park, and the restless city already growing up around it, the artist had set a simple bronze figure, the Angel of the Waters, drawn from the Gospel of St. John, symbol of the healing power of nature.
I think that angel is the most beautiful angel on earth. I mean, it is a very American angel. I think she has a very homespun quality. Her dress is not completely full length. It sort of stops at her ankles. In fact, I think Emma Stebbins, the woman who sculpted her, got a lot of bad reviews when the statue was unveiled because critics, who are always wrong about everything, said, "Oh, well, she looks like a milkmaid. This is not a grand, beautiful angel. This is a kind of a lumpy peasant girl angel." And I think that that's true to a certain extent, and part of what makes her exquisite. I love this gesture, as if she's reaching out and touching something incredibly specific and incredibly precious and within reach.
Ordinary New Yorkers took to the angel at once. In the years to come, Central Park would finally become the great democratic meeting ground Olmsted and Vox had always dreamed of, if not always in ways they had envisioned, as new elevated railways soon brought poor New Yorkers, as well as rich, up on weekends, and carried the city itself northward, in new residential districts that soon flanked the park. Less than a decade after the war, more than 8.5 million people a year were escaping the noise and tumult of the city streets and plunging into Central Park, which had become, the New York Times declared, a majestic breathing space for the life of the city.
Here are all classes, represented with common purpose, competitive with none, disposing of jealousy toward none, each adding by his mere presence to the pleasure of all the others. You may often see vast numbers of persons brought closely together, poor and rich, young and old, Jew and Gentile. Is it doubtful that it does men good to come together in this way, in pure air and under the light of heaven? Frederick Law Olmsted.
It's an amazing thing to go there on an afternoon and see people of all classes and races in this public square, this great public square, which is what it is, mingling and having fun and relaxing together. That just the experience of doing things together like that creates a common bond, a common identity, a common sense of the city.
Central Park is really the thing that makes life in New York possible. New York's not a practical proposition without Central Park, and I think that you get that sense of juxtaposition, that you're really in a wild place. And then you can look around you, and you're completely surrounded by skyscrapers, office buildings, and no other city in the world, I don't think, would allow that much of the most expensive acreage in the world to remain parkland.
Inscribed in Central Park was an extraordinary vision of what a great democratic city could be. Yet, beyond its borders, tremendous tensions and conflicts remained. By 1870, the park itself had become deeply embroiled in a bitter debate over who controlled the city's future: middle-class reformers, robber barons and financiers, Tammany Hall officials, or the people themselves. In the decades to come, as the forces unleashed by the Civil War brought a stunning new scale to the city and country, New York would become one of the most eerily divided places on earth, caught between an insatiable greed for money and wealth, and a yearning for something higher.
The second half of the 19th century, or the decades after the Civil War, do witness major change in the city. First of all, it becomes a true metropolis. It has 1 million people by 1860 and 5 million by the end of the century. So the sheer size of the city now is world class. So the problems it's encountering in terms of disease, in terms of police protection, in terms of fire, it's encountering these really as soon as any other city on the planet.
Between 1865 and 1898, New York would become home to the greatest concentration of wealth in human history. It would also become home to the greatest concentration of poverty, and to the greatest divisions of rich and poor. Not one city, but two. One dazzling and one benighted. One prosperous and one poor. One city of sunshine and another of shadow.
There was appalling misery in New York. Terrible crowding, terrible slums, all kinds of disease, crime, prostitution, children sleeping in the streets, children begging in the streets. It was crowded, it was dirty, it smelled terrible, much of it. Traffic was worse than it is today, if that's possible to imagine.
I think that we've tended to forget, or we've perhaps ignored and not paid enough attention to, how desperate life was for so many hundreds of thousands, millions of people in New York in this period. I think that an enormous number of people, especially people living in tenements, lived in life-threatening situations. Poverty in those days was conceived as something that was a personal problem. If you were poor, the reason probably has something to do with some character flaw, something that was wrong with you.
The opportunity to attain great wealth is within the reach of almost every man and woman. Let us remember, there is not a poor person in the United States who was not made poor by his own shortcomings. It is all wrong to be poor, anyhow. Reverend Russell H. Conwell.
Before the 19th century came to an end, New Yorkers would be forced to face the most perplexing conundrum of the industrial age. Where material progress is most fully realized, one reformer wrote in despair, there we find the deepest poverty.
Pre-Civil War New York was provincial. Pre-Civil War New York
was a place that the Dickenses and the Mrs. Trollops and so forth came, and Trollope himself came to see, how the natives disported themselves. Pre-Civil War New York was still an English province in an amazingly basic way. Post-Civil War New York was New York. New York was America. New York was the representation to the world and to itself of what America was like, what its difference to the power and might of America.
Between the end of the Civil War and the start of World War I, great new wealth was created in the city of unprecedented scale. But it wasn't just that there was great wealth. What's so important to understand, too, is that the wealth was being created by new ideas, new processes, a whole new kind of America. With the telegraph, with the advent of cheap steel, with the discovery of oil. And this new money coming from new ways of making money was creating a new city in New York, because it was the point at which all these curves, all these traffic patterns were converging.
More than any place else in America, New York City had won the Civil War. Supercharged by the demands of the 4-year-long struggle, the city's industrial machine had simply exploded, making New York the undisputed financial clearinghouse of the nation and the richest city in America. The New York Stock Exchange, operating out of its mammoth new headquarters at Broad Street and Wall, was soon trading more than $3.5 billion a year. The light of Mammon, one visitor reported, gleams on every face in Broadway and Wall Street.
The Civil War in America marks the watershed between a mercantile world or an agricultural world and capitalism, the Industrial Age. The Industrial Age in a big way, the age of machines, the age where fortunes are made by dominating a natural product. You define the fortunes of people in New York after the Civil War in terms of a resource, oil, coal, or something that also needs huge capitals, something like a railroad.
As the age of ships gave way to the age of rail and steam, 75-year-old Cornelius Vanderbilt sold his vast shipping empire and reinvested in railroads, ruthlessly consolidating 17 smaller lines to form a single giant system, the New York Central. An eccentric autocrat, utterly indifferent to public opinion, Vanderbilt traveled everywhere he could in his own crimson and gold railroad car, routinely terrorized his competitors, and rarely gave to charity. On principle. Let others do what I have done, he said, and they need not be around here begging.
New York City was based upon greed and based upon making money. Cornelius Vanderbilt, the Commodore, what a wonderful pirate he was. He never had a thought in his head except to make money.
A strange craziness is abroad in the land. Some mysterious spirit of evil has led our people into the blindest, wildest infatuation, wild and foolish speculation. At least half the people are living beyond their means. The Round Table, 1866.
Wall Street exploded in a frenzy of reckless, unregulated, and often unprincipled speculation.
There were no rules. All bets were off. You could do whatever you want. So people made the most outrageous efforts at basically boarding and seizing corporations and using them as playthings. You know, printing stock secretly in a basement and selling it to people until it was worthless. Rigging the market, trying to buy up all the silver and all the gold. There was an attempt to corner the nation's gold supply and then be in a position to make enormous profits that had zero ethical basis and zero fallout for the larger economy.
In 1869, a dapper but corrupt financial genius named Jay Gould and his partner, Jim Fisk, a flamboyant financier and ladies' man, tried to corner the market in gold, using money they had personally embezzled from the stockholders of the Erie Railroad.
The genuine aristocracy of the city stands stunned and helpless under the new order of things. They find themselves supplanted by upstart princes of shoddy. They move into remote new streets uptown and talk feelingly of the crash which is to come when the props are knocked from under this flimsy edifice of prosperity. Mark Twain.
The
thinkers of America, the intellectuals of America, uniformly were in despair at that moment. They were saying that America had taken a wrong turn and that we had saved the Union, but the Union had then really been given to the carpetbaggers, to the people the new rich, who had made money out of the Civil War, enormous fortunes being made out of the Civil War. And these new people were not the people that our thinkers had hoped were going to emerge from this fratricidal, monstrous thing, instead of which it was vulgar, aggressive, and it was Jim Fisk, it was Gould, it was the worst elements who would suddenly come to the top.
And still the boom went on. Powered by the surge of investment on Wall Street, the same steam and steel revolution unifying the continent now began transforming the city itself. In less than a decade, 4 elevated railroad lines stretched the length of the island, and the Upper East Side and Upper West Side had exploded in a frenzy of construction, as block after block was filled with working-class tenements and middle-class row houses. Once, transit lines had followed patterns of growth. Now they helped create them. Put the road there, Commodore Vanderbilt declared, and people will go there to live. Year after year, isolated farmland in the far-flung Bronx, along with hamlets in Queens and Staten Island, began to be pulled into the orbit of the rapidly growing metropolis.
It's the absolute size of New York which becomes so impressive in the second half of the 19th century. The southern part of the Bronx, which was then part of Westchester County, so that the Bronx is beginning to explode in population. All of Upper Manhattan, that area around Central Park, which was empty at the time of the Civil War. By 1900, it's all filled up. Brooklyn, for example, expands from being what is arguably the first suburb in the world, or certainly in the United States, until by the end of the century, it's the third largest city in the United States. That's incredible growth.
March 18th, 1865. Crossed at Wall Street Ferry and explored sundry new districts in Brooklyn. I hereby prophesy that in 1900 AD, Brooklyn will be the city and New York will be the suburb. It is inevitable that both go on growing as they have grown in the last 40 years. Brooklyn has room to spread, and New York has not. George Templeton Strong.
Year after year, New York hurtled blindly into the future, with scarcely a thought for what was being left behind. For more than 200 years, a venerable pear tree had stood at the corner of 3rd Avenue and 13th Street, where Peter Stuyvesant himself had planted it back in 1667. Now, in the winter of 1867, the coldest in living memory, the battle-scarred veteran of innumerable encounters with the lorries and wagons of Lower Manhattan succumbed to the ravages of time and the weather and was pulled down. The last living connection to the old Dutch settlement was gone.
New York is notoriously the largest and least loved of any of our great cities. Why should it be loved as a city? It is never the same city for a dozen years altogether. A man born 40 years ago finds nothing, absolutely nothing, of the New York he knew. If he chances to stumble upon a few old houses not yet leveled, he is fortunate. But the landmarks, the objects which marked the city to him as a city, are gone. Harper's Monthly.
On the morning of January 23rd, 1867, the citizens of New York and Brooklyn awoke to an extraordinary sight. The East River had frozen over solid, locking the ferries in ice, bringing traffic in the harbor to a standstill, and crippling commerce between the two cities for weeks. For years, people had been dreaming of a structure that could span the turbulent river, a gigantic bridge that would unite the two cities and free transportation from the tyranny of the weather. Now something, everyone agreed, had to be done. Before the ice had thawed that spring, the New York Bridge Company had been incorporated and charged with the task of finding someone capable of building such a structure.
They built the bridge because they saw New York City running out of space. Manhattan Island was finite. There was just so much of it, and it was filling up fast. But Brooklyn, it seemed, could expand endlessly out onto Long Island. Therefore, the bridge was built not to get to New York, but to get to Brooklyn. And it was seen as a way of having the city expand into that open space of Brooklyn, because nobody had yet imagined a city growing upward instead of out.
The very thing that made the bridge so crucial made it all but impossible to build. The East River was the busiest stretch of water in the world, filled with ferries, steamers, clipper ships, and launches. If there is to be a bridge, one skeptic wrote, it must take one grand flying leap from shore to shore over the masts of ships. There can be no piers or drawbridge. There must be only one great arch all the way across. There was probably only one man in the world who could build such a structure. An intense, enigmatic 61-year-old German-born engineer and inventor named John Augustus Roebling, who had already made a fortune pioneering the manufacture of wire rope. Now, with his son Washington, a former colonel in the Army Corps of Engineers, Roebling drew up plans for a structure far larger than anything ever before attempted. Its central span would be 1,600 feet long, half again as long as any bridge in existence, and its towers 275 feet tall, 7 times higher than the 4-story skyline of Manhattan. By the summer of 1869, work on the giant enterprise had begun. John Roebling himself was surveying the foundation for the Brooklyn Tower on the morning of June 28th, when a ferry rammed the pier he was standing on, crushing his right foot. Tetanus set in, then lockjaw, and after 3 weeks of agony, he died, leaving responsibility for the most ambitious engineering project of the 19th century on the shoulders of his 32-year-old son, Washington. In the end, it would prove far more difficult and take far longer than anyone could have imagined. Before it was over, the twin cities Washington Roebling hoped it would connect would have to descend into a maelstrom of political and financial chaos and rise again.
America is known as a country of enthusiasm and optimism, of a can-do spirit of engineering. New York was built on this can-do spirit of engineering. But New York is also a place of corruption. And so it's a place where people know that sometimes the bureaucracy will let you down, that you have to grease somebody's palm. So there's a different relationship to venality, to moral iniquity, more of an acceptance of it, that this is what people are like, you know? They're not perfect, they're not angelic.
To be a citizen of New York is a disgrace. The New Yorker belongs to a community worse governed by lower and baser blackguard scum than any city in Western Christendom. George Templeton Strong.
In the summer of 1871, as work on the Brooklyn Bridge began, New York City exploded in the biggest political scandal of its history. At the center of the storm stood another structure, only 100 yards away from the New York entrance to the bridge, an unfinished stone courthouse that by 1871 was entering its 12th year of construction, with no end in sight. The revelations about to emerge from it would show how politics worked in the sprawling commercial metropolis. They would also immortalize one man above all as the most corrupt urban politician in American history, Boss William M. Tweed.
If New York was going to have corruption, if New York was going to have a corrupt politician, it was going to have the biggest and most corrupt of anybody. And he was new. He was a new kind of corrupt politician. That, too, is part of it.
Boss Tweed, the name is associated with purely bad things now. The Tammany organization really was one of those local, shady organizations that also did do a lot of good things for the people they were supposed to be representing.
For years, a new kind of political organization had been rising from the streets of the Lower East Side. It was called Tammany Hall, and the men who ran it had few illusions, no ideology, and no ideals. What they had was a shrewd grasp of the new political opportunities in the sprawling city of immigrants. Reaching out to New York's despised and downtrodden Irish and German newcomers, Tammany alone offered them comfort and a voice in the system, knowing that on election day, they would reap the gratitude of the new voters.
People who were just off the boat, who were looking to make a way in the world, Tammany provided them with, an awful lot of real services. In these days, when so many people needed help, your kid's in trouble with the law, or your child's not doing well in school, you can't pay the rent, your husband's out of work, or your husband has just died, you're about to be evicted, you're looking for a job. Any of these kinds of things require the intervention of someone. And for an awful lot of people, that someone or something was Tammany, or the local Tammany leader.
Nothing was as famous as Tammany Hall. No American political figure has ever been quite as famous or as infamous as Boss Tweed. But we need to remember why it was that the political machine had such attraction to these immigrants.
An ex-fireman and one-time chairmaker from the Lower East Side, there had never been anyone quite like William M. Tweed. Over 6 feet tall and nearly 300 pounds, he was surprisingly nimble and graceful on his feet. Caricatured by his Republican opponents as a vulgar, hard-drinking Irishman, he was in fact a fourth-generation Scots Protestant, unfailingly courteous and nearly teetotal. He was also a superb politician who took care of his mainly immigrant constituency, providing jobs for the unemployed, coal in winter, and orphanages, hospitals, and shelters for the poor.
He was one of the first people who saw the power of mass politics in the cities. And for all his thievery, there was the recognition of mobilizing this mass of people to some political end. I think he's not remembered for that. He's remembered for the $50 million that he stole, which if you wanted to get the equivalent today, multiply times 10.
Accelerating New York's already explosive growth still further, Tweed and his associates brazenly siphoned off staggering sums from the hundreds of city projects under their control, and helped robber barons like Jay Gould and Jim Fisk make off with still more. There were lucrative contracts for grateful builders who happily paid Tammany's leaders enormous cash kickbacks to get them. There were thousands of jobs for Tammany's loyal constituents who gratefully voted Tammany's leaders back in power. New York's upper classes, meanwhile, professed to be appalled, but quietly looked the other way as real estate values in the city skyrocketed. It all worked like a machine, a political machine, and no one knew how that machine worked better than William Tweed, who by 1870 had concentrated more power in himself than anyone in the city's history.
It was Tweed who helped maneuver the money through the city council or the board of aldermen as well then was, for the Brooklyn Bridge, for Central Park, for a lot of the road repair and the creation of streets and avenues in uptown Manhattan. Now, he made a lot of money with that, and it was absolutely corrupt.
Tweed's first position was Commissioner of Public Works. He was no fool. And if you know where the sewer lines are going to go, and if you know where the new street extensions are going to be opened up, and you get there first, and you buy up that territory, all you got to do is sit back, wait, and boom, the price explodes. So Tweed, in fact, became one of the largest real estate owners in the city.
I think there was something in him, some overpowering appetite that he could never slake. He couldn't have one mistress, he had to have two. He couldn't have one roast beef, he had to have four, and he couldn't have two judges, he had to have them all, and finally he caught up with them and destroyed them.
In 1870, as newspaper editors and indignant reformers began questioning where Tweed's lavish lifestyle came from, all eyes turned to the still unfinished county courthouse on Chambers Street, a special project of Tweed's. Begun in 1858, it was supposed to have cost $350,000. 12 years later, the price tag had reached $13 million and kept right on rising.
Somewhere on this one building, which is actually quite a nice building, wound up costing more than the entire Houses of Parliament. Well, the deal is straightforward. We want to buy a lot of chairs. How much does that chair cost? Let's say $5. Now, says Tweed, $5. You mean $50? Oh, I do? All right. And, give me the chair, $50, 20 back for you, and so forth.
Even the most worldly New Yorkers knew that something had to be done. People begin to tire of holding their noses, George Templeton Strong wrote, and are looking about in a helpless way for some remedy.
No caliph, Khan, or Caesar has risen to power or opulence more rapidly than Tweed I. 10 years ago, this monarch was pursuing the humble occupation of a chairmaker. He now rules the state as Napoleon ruled France. There is absolutely nothing in the city which is beyond the reach of the insatiable gang who have obtained possession of it. The New York Times.
In 1869, a German-born artist named Thomas Nast, with close ties to the Republican Party, began publishing a series of political cartoons in Harper's Weekly. Week after week, Nast relentlessly excoriated what he called the Tammany Hall Ring. There was Peter Brains Sweeney, the city treasurer, Mayor Abraham Oakey Hall, Tweed's puppet in City Hall, Richard Slippery Dick Conway, the comptroller, and Boss Tweed himself, whom Nast depicted as a licentious, balding, overfed monster, literally devouring the city.
Really did the most extraordinary job of attacking Tweed and exposing the Tweed ring in Harper's Weekly. Those pictures will live forever. The way you can never separate Nixon from Woodward and Bernstein, you can't separate Tweed from Thomas Nast. They're wed together for the rest of history, I guess.
On July 8, 1871, the New York Times joined the fray, publishing excerpts from secret courthouse records, obtained from a disgruntled city official. Tweed had cheated out of thousands of dollars in kickbacks. The figures were astonishing. 11 thermometers had been purchased for $7,500. Dust brooms for $41,000. One contractor had been paid $5.5 million for window shades, carpets, and furniture. It would never be clear how much Tweed's corruption had been exaggerated by the press. The New York Times put the final tally at almost $200 million. But in the end, it didn't matter. New York needed a villain equal in scale to its giant park and giant bridge. And Tweed fit the bill, in part because he simply looked the part.
He ended up a sad, tragic figure because he basically took the fall for a system. And the system involved the bankers, the so-called respectable people, the ghouls and fisks and all those guys who were not really indicted for the things that Tweed ended up doing, taking the fall for.
On December 15th, 1871, Boss Tweed was indicted on 3 counts of fraud and grand larceny, and 2 months later, 220 misdemeanor charges. He was sentenced to 12 years in prison, and though the convictions were later overturned, a civil suit stripped him of his assets and forced him into prison. Gaunt and ailing, he eked out his last years in jail. In the winter of 1875, he somehow slipped past his guards and escaped to Spain, but he was quickly recaptured and returned to prison. The Spanish police, it was later said, had recognized him from one of Thomas Nast's cartoons. On April 12, 1878, he died of pneumonia in his cell in the Ludlow Street jail he himself had built, penniless and broken.
He gets a lot of the blame, probably that belongs to a lot more people, a lot more people who we think of as legitimate politicians. There are other bosses that had a smoother style. I think part of the reason that people remember Boss Tweed so much was that he was so flamboyant, and by the time his downfall, he was such a leftover from another age.
A villain of more brains would have had a modest dwelling and guzzled in secret. His successors here will not imitate him in this, but that he will have successors, there is no doubt.
let us remember that he fell without loss of reputation among the bulk of poor voters of this city, who revere his memory and look on him as the victim of rich man's malice, as, in short, a friend to the needy and the working man. Harper's Weekly.
Lost in the uproar of Tweed's downfall were the needs of New York's desperate immigrant poor, which Tammany alone had been addressing, however imperfectly. Though some steps had been taken to alleviate the worst suffering amongst the poor, the ceaseless influx of new immigrants into New York continued to outstrip the city's social services. In the wake of the Tweed scandal, even Walt Whitman's vision of the city's democratic promise began to darken.
The spectacle is appalling. The official services of America are saturated in corruption, bribery, falsehood, maladministration. The great cities reek with respectable as much as non-respectable robbery and scoundrelism. Walt Whitman.
New York was not, in my opinion, coping with the problems of the new industrial order, but it was going to start coping with them because in 1873, Al Smith was born. Al Smith's grandparents had come to New York in 1841, and they had come to a wharf near the bottom of the Brooklyn Bridge with the Westmeath Line docked, and had taken rooms in a rooming house there, a tenement, just because they were too tired to walk any further. By the time Smith was born in 1873, the Irish sections of New York was a wilderness of tenements stretching away from the Brooklyn Bridge. That was the heart of the Tammany machine.
Alfred Emanuel Smith, Al Smith, one of the most beloved figures in the history of New York politics, grew up on South Street, playing along the waterfront among the maze of masts, bowsprits, and rigging. His father, a genial self-employed teamster with a big booming voice, regularly put in 15 hours a day, 6 days a week, hauling cargo around the waterfront, fiercely proud of being able to keep his family above the poverty level. From the windows of his family's third-floor apartment, the boy liked to watch the sweeping expanse of the East River, the traffic of horses and people on South Street, and especially the gigantic bridge that was slowly filling the sky above the harbor.
The bridge and I grew up together. I never lost the memory of the admiration and envy I felt for the men swarming up, stringing the cables, putting in the roadways as the bridge took shape. Al Smith.
One winter Sunday, Smith and his father stole into the construction site and walked across the rough wooden planking of the unfinished span. For years afterward, his father liked to say that he and his boy had been the first New Yorkers ever to use the Brooklyn Bridge. By the time Smith was born, the future of New York City was beginning to emerge on the crowded streets and wards of the Lower East Side, where immigrants by the thousands continued to pour in, looking for a chance to start over.
The port culture of Lower Manhattan was a place in which the boundaries between one community and the next were not tightly drawn. In fact, they really didn't exist in the way I think we tend to think of them in terms of segregated ethnic enclaves, in which you had African Americans mingling with Irish, mingling with Bowery boys, mingling with women of various kinds. It was Irish. It was Chinese. People were learning about each other's cultures. There was intermarriage going on. There were people living together. In point of fact, all of these different people were living in the same area, intermingling and having contact with each other. And that's what made the downtown cosmopolitanism, that downtown everyday mixing, so unusual. It was an amazingly porous and fluid process. In many ways, an unprecedented mingling of people, not only from Europe, obviously, but people from all parts of the world. And it's that kind of juxtaposition that I think made this particular port culture so rich and so diverse.
Watching African Americans and Irish immigrants dancing and mimicking and parodying each other in minstrel shows along the Bowery. Walt Whitman predicted it would one day give rise to a native grand opera in America. In the years to come, as Al Smith rose through the ranks of the Tammany machine to become one of the most powerful politicians in the city, he would never forget the place he grew up or the people he had known there.
Once this place begins to really be working within the rhythms of a global and national capitalist economy, you get these kind of oscillating rhythms. The city grows in surges, it grows in spurts. There's a boom, and then there's a crash. There's a sense of optimism, of buoyancy, of building, often of corruption, also of wild speculation, and also of luxury and extravagance and such. And then crash.
The worst financial crisis of the 19th century struck in the fall of 1873. Like a cyclone, a young banker named J.P. Morgan remembered, which came upon us without an hour's warning. Wild competition and reckless overbuilding on the nation's railroads had already strained Wall Street's financial markets to the limit, when, in early September, the Northern Pacific Line went under, bringing down with it the largest private bank in the nation.
September 19th, 1873, panic grows on Wall Street. The hubbub multiplies, and indications are greater than any crisis since 1857. Many notable speculators have suspended, among them Fisk and Hatch, reputed impregnably strong. All this may be a mere flurry, or may be much more. George Templeton Strong.
The next day, September 20th, 1873, with the entire market in freefall, the New York Stock Exchange closed the trading floor for the first time in its 81-year history, hoping to stem the tide. It didn't work.
October 27th, 1873. Wall Street continues in feverish, nervous malaise. Faith in financial agents is gone. Factories and employers throughout the country are discharging hands, working half-time, or reducing wages. October 29th. Prospects for the coming winter look darker and darker. George Templeton Strong.
The panic of 73 is just a panic, but over the next 4 or 5 years, you had a whopping depression. It was then known as the Great Depression. Credit seizes up. Bankers are not willing to make loans to factory owners. Factory owners don't have money, they lay off their employees. Their employees have no income, they can't buy goods. Demand goes down. Demand goes down, other factories start laying off workers, and you get this tremendous downward crunch.
Private associations were called upon and were overwhelmed in the Depression of 1873 as well. I mean, they really didn't have the wherewithal to respond to the enormous need. And in an immigrant neighborhood where people are still just getting on their feet, without all of the deep roots that you need to survive a huge storm, it was particularly hard hit.
The homeless population ballooned. In those days, police stations would open their basements, and these basements, vermin-covered, were crammed with people seeking shelter. Some people even talked about building houses in Central Park and elsewhere for the people who had no shelter. But there was also, in fact, protests. And in 1874, for instance, they rallied in Tompkins Square Park and with a series of demands that the city should help out the victims of this downside of the business cycle. The city's response was to send the police on horseback into Tompkins Square, batons flailing, and these people were sort of dispersed and driven out.
One bleak February morning, as the Depression stretched into its 4th year, a curious sculpture, the giant amputated hand of a woman, appeared on the west side of Madison Square, part of a towering statue the French hoped to present as a gift to the American people, if New Yorkers would simply pay for the pedestal. But New Yorkers refused. No true patriot, the New York Times declared, can support expenditures for a bronze female in the present state of our finances. For 5 years, the huge upraised hand stood on Fifth Avenue, An embarrassment, one newspaper complained, to nursemaids and mothers, unable to explain to their young charges what the surreal sculpture, with its 8-foot index finger and 12-inch nails, was doing there. Down along the East River, meanwhile, work on the Brooklyn Bridge ground on, with no end in sight. Battered by financial troubles, strikes, political corruption, and a series of nightmarish accidents. For 7 years, Washington Roebling had struggled to keep the immense project on track without the aid of his father. Supervising work on the foundations, deep beneath the riverbed, the chief engineer himself had been stricken by a mysterious new affliction called Caisson's disease, or the bends, and hadn't been seen at the site for years. But still the work went on, Roebling monitoring progress through binoculars from his bedroom window, and relaying instructions to the construction site through his wife Emily, who had taken over day-to-day supervision of the project. Slowly, the gaunt stone towers rose above the troubled metropolis, bringing an entirely new scale to the two cities. Rising above the rooftops like visitors from another planet, the 120 million pound structures were the most massive man-made objects on the North American continent. On a cold, windy morning in January 1876, in the very heart of the Depression, a photographer named Joshua Beale wrestled his cumbersome equipment up 30 flights of stairs, then stepped out onto an open platform atop the recently completed Brooklyn Tower and set to work, carefully exposing 5 glass plate negatives to form a single giant photograph, more than 7 feet long. The breathtaking panoramic image showed New Yorkers the city as they had never seen it before, a city that had grown too vast to be grasped or understood in conventional terms. No longer simply a city, but a teeming, unknowable metropolis.
Far as the eye can reach, it stretches away. This is not even a city, in the sense in which we understand the word. Seen from here, it is so colossal. It encloses so formidable an accumulation of human efforts as to overpass the bounds of imagination.
Though few people could see it, the Panic of 1873 and the terrible depression that followed had set the stage for one of the most dramatic transformations in the history of American capitalism. To a startling degree, it would be driven by one man, an imperious 38-year-old Wall Street banker, who by 1876 was on his way to becoming one of the most powerful men in America. His name was John Pierpont Morgan, and as New York lay sunk in the depths of depression, he had begun to mastermind the rebirth of the entire American economy.
Well, he first arrived in the 1860s when it was really the wild and woolly days of Wall Street, and you could get away with almost anything. And he wanted to bring order to it, because he realized you couldn't have a very successful market unless people knew what the rules were and the rules were enforced. And he loved the rules. He loved to play solitaire. I mean, this is a real window into Morgan's psyche. I mean, he loved to create order using the rules of the game out of the chaos created by the shuffle. And that's what he wanted to do on Wall Street and the railroads.
He was colossally arrogant. He had tremendous drive and conviction that came from precisely believing that he was a force of history, that he was in tune with these new higher evolutionary trends and acting for some larger good. He was terrifying. I mean, he had these great eyes. Edward Steichen called him in a famous photograph that sort of glared through you.
Well, apparently the force of his character was quite something. There are people who did meet him and left records that it was like watching the headlights of an oncoming train. He was a very formidable looking man, very large, like bulky man. He was fond of food, not fond of exercise. He had a very large, bulbous, extremely ugly nose. So he suffered from a condition called acne rosacea. And most of the photographs of him, the nose has been retouched.
From his offices at number 23 Wall Street, Morgan went right to work, determined to save Wall Street from itself. "We do not want financial convulsions," he declared, "and have one thing one day and another thing the next. Wasteful competition must be replaced by a community of interest.
Quite surprisingly, for somebody who has been cast as the high priest of modern capitalism, Morgan was not really a free marketer. He thought that there needed to be a kind of managed competition in American industry and American society, and that he would do the managing.
First, he forced the railroads to stop undercutting each other, putting his own partners on the board of every company he bailed out to maintain discipline. Then, he began buying up railroads himself, eliminating redundancies, and reorganizing smaller lines into ever larger ones, all of them run increasingly out of New York. It was called Morganizing.
And what they tried to do, despite all of the theoretical glorification about free market capitalism, they hate the marketplace, they hate untrammeled competition, and they set out to try to rein it in. And basically what Morgan and others do is they take a lot of these competing firms, smash them together, and create new gigantic corporate megaliths. They birth the corporate economy.
Few people in New York had any idea what Morgan was doing, and many who did worried increasingly about the power he was accumulating. But by 1882, the Depression was a thing of the past, and New York was once again awash in money and power, thanks in part to J.P. Morgan. That summer, as if to signal the return of prosperity, a team of workers led by a 35-year-old inventor named Thomas Alva Edison labored round the clock to finish assembling the first permanent electrical power plant in the world at 257 Pearl Street. On September 4th, 1882, at 3 p.m. precisely, an electrician threw the master switch, and as current surged through 14 miles of underground cable, 3,000 incandescent lamps in Lower Manhattan began to burn. The effect, one awestruck reporter wrote, can scarcely be described. So weird and so beautiful it is. The era of gaslight was coming to an end.
It was an amazing moment. The lights actually went on at about 3 o'clock, so you couldn't really see them. But the reporters said that by 7, as natural light died away, the sight of downtown Manhattan with these little flickering light bulbs looking like thousands of individual flames was breathtakingly beautiful.
Thomas Edison himself was not at Pearl Street when the switch was pulled, but in the headquarters of his principal financial backer, J.P. Morgan, who had arranged the financing for Edison's project, then made sure his offices were the first in the city to be illuminated by electricity. Night after night, one man later recalled, the lights at 23 Wall Street shone far into the night, when all else was dark over New York. It was J.P. Morgan and his partners, charting a course into the giddiest heights of capitalism and on into the future.
What is the greatest image we have in our minds of our human destiny? It's going from one shore to another. The story of the Bible, the Hebrew people, begins with the idea of Abraham, Father Abraham, going from one part of the world to another. And the word Hebrew used to mean, for a lot of people, I don't know, Hebrew, the passage over the river. I've always been fascinated by that phrase in Whitman's poem. There was always a passage over the river. When we think about our destiny as human beings, we're going to die someday. And we always see ourselves traveling from one thing to another. And we're always, so to speak, making our passage into and over many things in the world. Well, it sounds trite and banal, but the idea of life as a journey, the idea of life as expectancy, reaches its absolute maximum in Brooklyn Bridge.
By the spring of 1883, 7 full years after the completion of the towers, and 14 years after work had first begun, the Brooklyn Bridge was nearly complete. It had taken 3 times longer and cost nearly twice as much as its designer, John Rowley, had estimated. More than 5,000 working men, Irish and German and Italian immigrants mainly, had toiled for as little as $2 a day to build it, stone by stone, wire after wire, foot by foot. Erecting the great towers had been impressive enough, but what came after was even more astonishing. 14,000 miles of wire rope had been spun back and forth across the river and draped over the towers in 4 giant cables. From them, an avenue wider than Broadway had been suspended across a span nearly a third of a mile long. From below, the roadway seemed to float on air, supported without visible effort by its gossamer web of steel. Now, with the official opening set for May 24th, all that remained were the finishing touches.
It's the beginning of heroic New York. This is where New York not only rose into the sky for the first time in an intentional way, but it was built to last. It was built to stay. Built to be right there at the harbor where everybody was making their entrance from the old world to the new world, standing there for all time to say we didn't come just to spend a little while. We came here to this new continent, this new world, this new way of life to stay. We mean business. We're here.
5 days before the opening ceremonies, electricians finished installing 70 electric arc lamps along the suspenders. Near midnight, the dynamos were switched on for the first time to test whether the lights were working. Commuters on the last ferries to Brooklyn looked up in astonishment as the majestic bridge shone out of the darkness in the blue and white glow. Whether they knew it or not, they were seeing the future: electricity and steam.
The Brooklyn Bridge marks the beginning of what we might call the vertical city. And it's going to be able to go up. It's going to be more heroic in scale than are the towers of the Brooklyn Bridge because of the element of steel that's in the bridge. Because of the cables. You can't have high-rise buildings without elevators. You can't have elevators without cables of steel. You can't have the grid work. You can't have the skeletal interior of skyscrapers without having steel.
May 24th, 1883. Officially renamed the People's Day in honor of the bridge, dawned fair and mild, without a cloud in the sky.
One of, I think, the striking events of that celebration day is the absence of the Irish. It was opened on Queen Victoria's birthday. The Irish saw that as an anti-Irish act, and they didn't attend. And a significant number of the people who built that bridge were Irish working class hags who didn't make a lot of money and who never got a lot of credit.
By noon, virtually every business in town had shut its doors. As tens of thousands of cheering New Yorkers looked on, President Chester A. Arthur and Governor Grover Cleveland led the grand procession down Broadway and up and over the Great Bridge. They were greeted on the other side by Brooklyn's mayor, Seth Low, and Emily Roebling, standing in for her husband, Washington, who was still too weak to attend. Later, the president and the governor called on the chief engineer at his home in Brooklyn Heights. Roebling was honored by the visit, but questioned the need for all the fuss and ceremony. Why can't they just put up a sign saying, "The bridge is open," he said.
The beautiful and stately structure fulfills the fondest hope. The impression upon the visitor is one of astonishment that grows with every visit. No one who has ever been upon it can ever forget it. Not one shall see it and not feel prouder to be a man. Mayor Seth Low.
It requires no spirit of prophecy to foretell the union of New York and Brooklyn. The river which divides them will soon cease to be a line of separation, and bestrode by the Colossus of Commerce will prove a link which will bind them together.
All afternoon, while the speeches dragged on, thousands of New Yorkers and Brooklynites ventured out onto the bridge for the first time, astonished by the beauty of the structure and by the glorious view, and to be so high above a river.
Put yourself back in the place of a New Yorker or someone living in Brooklyn in the year 1884, 85, and you went on a Sunday afternoon out onto the Brooklyn Bridge. First of all, you were up higher than you'd ever been in your life, because there were no buildings that high. And you were out over the salt water over the East River, and seagulls were flying beneath you as they went underneath the bridge. And great, if you were lucky, great sailing ships were coming up or down the river. And if they were really some of the big ones, like the clipper ships, they might be trimming their top gallants in order to get underneath the bridge. And steamboats and ferry boats. And everybody out promenading on the boardwalk. Incidentally, a boardwalk, a promenade, that had never been part of a bridge before and has never been part of any bridge since. And it's built there for the purpose of giving people the experience of the thrill, the uncommon, unprecedented thrill of what can happen to you, what you can see and experience in a city.
At dusk, the bridge was cleared, and the greatest firework display in the city's history began. For over an hour, fireworks streamed skyward from the bridge itself, from boats below, and from both shores, while still more were launched from gas balloons. At the astonishing finale, 500 rockets were touched off simultaneously, blossoming in the night sky above the gorgeous structure.
When the perfected East River Bridge shall permanently and uninterruptedly connect the two cities, the daily thousands who cross it will consider it a sort of natural and inevitable phenomenon, such as the rising and setting of the sun, and they will unconsciously overlook the preliminary difficulties surmounted before the structure spanned the stream, and will perhaps undervalue the indomitable courage, the absolute faith, the consummate genius which assured the engineer's triumph. Thomas Kinsella, the Brooklyn Eagle.
The mistake is to take a structure like that for granted, to assume that it's always been there. It just happened. What did it take to build that? Think of New York. If you don't want to think of the Brooklyn Bridge, think of all of New York as a metaphor for effort. Spectacular, unprecedented, often very original effort. Work. Good work. Which is one of the promises of America. You come here, you can do good work, and you will be judged by the work you do. You can find pride and self-respect and identity through the work you do. You can be an actor. You can build a bridge. You can write the poem. You can make $1 million. That's the promise. Doesn't mean the promise will be fulfilled for everybody, but that's the promise. And no other society, no other place in the world had ever offered all of that.
New Yorkers and Brooklynites took to the bridge at once, as if no one could remember what life had been like without it. On its first full day of traffic, nearly 2,000 vehicles and more than 150,000 pedestrians streamed between the two cities. Then, on May 31st, 1883, Memorial Day, just 1 week after the opening ceremony, disaster struck. 20,000 people were out on the bridge, enjoying the pristine weather, when a woman tripped on a narrow staircase packed with people. Someone screamed that the bridge was falling, and panic ripped through the dense, surging crowd. In the confusion and terror that followed, 12 people were crushed to death on the packed stairway, and hundreds more trampled in the stampede. Among the horrified onlookers was 10-year-old Al Smith, whose ailing father had worked as a watchman on the bridge during construction. He and a group of friends were playing below the Manhattan Tower when a dark cloud of coats, hats, parasols, and pocketbooks began to rain down upon them from the roadway above. That was my first view of a great calamity, he later recalled. I did not sleep for nights. In the years to come, Smith would be no stranger to tragedy.
And when Al Smith was a child, His family was poor. His father was a big, brawny trucker. But he got very sick when Smith was very little. And when Smith was 13, he died. He died penniless. And when they were walking back, it was Smith, his sister Mary, and his mother. And when they were walking back from the funeral, the dread in their hearts were that they were going to be split up. Because in those days, if a widow had said, I need a pension, I need welfare, I can't support my children, what the state did in most cases was take them away and put them in an institution. And as they're walking back from the funeral, Al Smith's mother said, I don't know where to turn. And Al Smith said, I'm here, I can take care of you. And Smith went to work at the age of 13. First, he had jobs as a runner for trucking companies, but at about the age of 17, he went to work for the Fulton Fish Market, rolling heavy barrels of fish up the ramps from the ships. You know, he used to say, I only have 1 degree, FFM, Fulton Fish Market. And the hours he worked were interesting. He worked from 5 in the morning till 6:30 at night, 6 days a week. The only day he didn't work those hours was Saturday. Then he worked from 3 in the morning till 6:30 at night. But he took care of his family, started running errands for Tammany, worked his way up through the machine.
Though the hours were long, at $12 a week, the job paid enough to keep the family together. And soon Smith had begun to rise within the tightly-knit community of New York's 4th Ward, befriending members of the downtown Tammany Club and running errands for a popular district leader named Tom Foley. In the evenings, he sang old Irish favorites in a local saloon owned by Foley himself. Sitting in the audience, some of the older Tammany bosses began to take notice of the energetic and affable young man, whose strong, distinctive voice, they said, might one day make him a good candidate for office. Though the East River had been spanned, other chasms remained, which in the years to come would grow ever wider and deeper, and prove even more difficult to stand. As immigrants in numbers greater than ever before poured into New York, fueling the most dynamic industrial economy on earth, another migration was underway, of millionaires, as the nation's wealthiest citizens now converged on Manhattan, which had become the mecca of all who sought power and prestige in America. From Pittsburgh came steel magnates Andrew Carnegie and Henry Frick. From Chicago, Philip Armour, who had made a fortune packing meat. From Cleveland, John D. Rockefeller, the oil magnate, well on his way to becoming the richest man in the world.
It was like a magnet for capital and for people who were having ideas that were going to increase capital. You had to talk to your bankers, you had to talk to other people who were doing things, and eventually most of them did have houses in New York as well, even if they kept residence elsewhere. It was the center of the American universe.
The one thing I know after 81 years of life is that the world's divided between insiders and outsiders, and everybody wants to be an insider. And so you come to the city in which there are more opportunities, there are more open doors, there are more ways to become an insider than probably anywhere else on earth.
By 1890, nearly half the millionaires in America, 1,800 in all, had flocked into the city and its suburbs, bringing with them a scale of extravagance startling even by the standards of New York. Along Fifth Avenue, once lined with somber brownstones, a parade of opulent mansions soon stretched more than 2.5 miles, each more extravagant than the next.
The interminable succession of luxurious mansions proclaims a wild abundance. This avenue has visibly been willed and created by sheer force of millions, which has left not an inch of ground untouched.
It's the place to make it and the place to flaunt it. And in the 19th century, as in the 20th century, the difference between the 1880s and the 1980s is when people flaunted it in the 1880s, they put on a public display. The city became a great, big, beautiful outdoor museum, a kind of urban paradise. That public display was fantastic. The Vanderbilts were not embarrassed to get into their equipages in front of their houses and ride up and down Fifth Avenue. And anybody, if he had just a daring do, the temerity, could stand there and be part of this urban drama.
It is only a matter of 3 miles from Madison Square to Hester Street. But who would dream, who had not seen it, that the same town held within so short a distance scenes and people so contrasted? Harper's Monthly.
Though the gap between them grew wider with each passing year, rich and poor alike were greeted now, as they came into the city, by an astonishing sight, rising like an apparition from the middle of the bay. On the rainy, windswept afternoon of October 28, 1886, the gift the French had been trying to give for more than 20 years was finally unveiled, its pedestal paid for in the end by the nickels and dimes of hundreds of thousands of ordinary New Yorkers.
The promised land flies before us like the mirage. Material progress does not merely fail to relieve poverty, it actually produces it. This association of progress with poverty is the great enigma of our times. It is the riddle which the Sphinx of Fate puts to our civilization, and which not to answer is to be destroyed. Henry George.
5 days after the statue was unveiled, New Yorkers went to the polls. On the ballot was a brilliant social theorist named Henry George, committed as no candidate before him to closing the gap between rich and poor, and running on a platform that called for a land tax, better housing and working conditions, and free public transportation for the poor. Why should there be such abject poverty in this city? George demanded. We are toiling perhaps for Mrs. Astor, or the heirs of some dead Dutchman.
We have to remember that there's been a counter-vision of what New York City should be, and it's been emerging out of the working class and immigrant quarters. An odd test moment of this takes place in 1886 when Henry George, a land reformer, runs for the mayoralty of New York City, and he puts together an astonishing coalition of the disaffected and the outcast.
But in the end, Henry George's United Labor Party was no match for Tammany Hall. Frightened by the strength of George's support amongst the immigrant poor who kept it in power, Tammany threw its immense machine behind a moderate Democratic businessman named Abram Hewitt, who attacked George's party as the enemies of civilization and order. On Election Day, he was resoundingly defeated, and the gulf he had hoped to bridge grew wider. One summer afternoon, as the 19th century came to a close, an Irish-American vaudeville singer named Charles Lawler asked his friend James Blake, a salesman in a hat shop, to come up with the lyrics for a tune that had been rattling around in his head for some time. Something about New York, Lawler said. Between serving customers, Blake found himself thinking of the old neighborhood on 18th Street, where he had grown up, and of the people he had known there. Jakey Krause, the baker, and his friend Little Jimmy Crow, and Mamie O'Rourke, who had first taught him how to dance. Set to the lovely lilting two-step Lawler had composed, Blake's haunting memories of the sidewalks of New York would go on to become an enormous hit across the country, and one of the most popular songs ever written about New York City.
East side, west side, all around the town. The tots sang ring around Rosie. London Bridge is falling down. Boys and girls together. Me and Mamie O'Rourke tripped the light fantastic on the sidewalks of New York. Things have changed since those times. Some are up in G, others they are on the hog. and have a twirl on the sidewalks of New York.
Though few people knew it, the heartbreaking tune marked the end of an era in the city's history, and the beginning of another. In the years to come, the Irish and German immigrants whose experience it commemorated would begin to move on, even as a new and far larger influx of peoples began to overtake the old, transforming forever the sidewalks of New York.
Walt Whitman said, "I chant the divine average." Whitman wrote so movingly about talking about the immigrants. "I sing of the immigrants 15 to 20,000 a day pouring ashore." And of course, Whitman's vision was of a democratic society transforming their lives, bringing them together and transforming it. But the fact is that in the Gilded Age, in my opinion, Whitman's optimism wasn't happening. What was happening was what Lincoln Steffens and Jacob Riis wrote about. New York was the New York of child labor in the sweatshops. I mean, we don't even think of what child labor was. It was little children working next to their mothers, 6 and sometimes 7 days a week in rooms in which there were no windows because the factory owners didn't want them distracted, working all the days of their youth away.
In October 1890, a curious volume went on sale in the bookstores of New York. Called How the Other Half Lives, it had been written by a 41-year-old Danish-born police reporter named Jacob Riis. It would change forever the way people thought about the city. Riis had come to New York in 1870, when he was just 21, with $40 in his pocket. The money soon ran out, and he had learned firsthand what immigrant life could be like in the sprawling metropolis. Homeless, often hungry, and out of work, he had drifted into the crime-infested world of the Five Points slum, dozing on the cold, filthy floors of police lodging houses. More than once, he considered killing himself. Eventually, he landed on his feet and managed to find work as a police reporter for the New York Tribune, and spent the next 10 years exploring the densely crowded slums of the Lower East Side. The sights, he later said, gripped my heart until I felt that I must tell of them or burst. Determined to show the world what he had seen, Riis began publishing magazine articles, but they seemed to make no impression, he wrote. He thought of taking pictures, but the tenements were too dark for the photographs to come out. Then, in 1887, a breakthrough came with the invention of a new photographic device, a magnesium flash powder that flooded even the deepest shadow with a brilliant flash of light. Armed with the new apparatus, Riis and his assistants plunged into the Five Points.
With their way illuminated by spasmodic flashes, as bright and brief as those of lightning itself, a mysterious party has lately been startling the town. Denizens of the dives, tramps and bummers in their lodgings, have marveled at the phenomenon. What they saw was 3 or 4 figures in the gloom, a ghostly tripod, some weird and uncanny movements, the blinding flash, and then the patter of retreating footsteps, and the mysterious visitors were gone. The New York Sun, February 12, 1888.
They would go into places, especially at night, with the brand new flash powder attachment and surprise people, sleepers in these kind of collective sleeping rooms, or drinkers in these rot gut saloons.
The images Riis brought back brought wealthy and middle-class New Yorkers face to face with a reality most had long sought to avoid. Their city, one of the wealthiest in the world, had become home to more than 1 million overworked and undernourished people, often living in conditions of unspeakable horror. He went everywhere, carrying his camera down obscure courtyards and back ways, with names like Ragpicker's Row, Blind Man's Alley, and Bottle Alley. In a place called Bandit's Roost, he photographed a dozen men, all said to be wanted for murder. He was especially moved by the plight of the young, the ragged street Arabs who sold newspapers by day and slept in alleys by night. The child laborers, who often worked 7 days a week in stifling factories and sweatshops. And the tens of thousands of abandoned and orphaned children who had been left to fend for themselves. But what horrified him most was the unspeakable conditions in which so many New Yorkers were forced to live.
You have a vast influx of new immigrant groups. So that whereas in 1860 it was essentially a city of small homes, by 1900, the most crowded neighborhoods in the world are in New York City, especially on the Lower East Side, but also in East Harlem. You have the rise of tenement housing, which is really worse than anything that was ever seen in the United States. And it's probably about as bad as anything that's ever been put up anywhere in the world.
A tenement, briefly defined, is simply a building that concentrates as many people into as little space as possible, with the lowest overhead costs for the landlord. The tenements began sometime in the middle of the 19th century, and there were no laws governing the tenement, so it really stuffed people into 6 or 7 floors of rickety walk-up, jammed into as many rooms as possible, many of which were interior rooms with no light of any sort or air.
I went up the dark stairs in one of those tenements, and there I trod upon a baby. It is the regular means of introduction in the old dark houses, but I was never able to get used to it. I photographed the baby, standing with its back against the public sink, in a pool of filth that overflowed on the floor. I do not marvel that 1 in 5 children in the rear tenement, into which the sunlight never comes, was killed by the house. It seems strange, rather, that any survived. Jacob Riis.
Many of the tenements were life-threatening, literally. That is to say that the threat of disease, infectious bacterial diseases like dysentery, for example, was always there, and epidemics could spread rapidly. The high death rate, the high sickness rate. This was the reality for many, many hundreds of thousands, millions of New Yorkers at any given moment.
Ill-fed and ill-clothed, packed into buildings with few sinks or toilets, and sometimes with no plumbing at all. Tenement dwellers were prey to every kind of disease: diphtheria, influenza, typhoid, pneumonia. Worst of all was the disease called the White Plague, tuberculosis. Every year, 20,000 new cases were reported in the slums. Every year, 8,000 people died of the disease.
July and August spell death to the army of little ones, whom the doctor's skill is powerless to save. Sleepless mothers walk the street in the gray of the early dawn, trying to stir a cooling breeze to fan the brow of the sick baby. There is no sadder sight than this patient devotion against fearfully hopeless odds. Little coffins are stacked mountains high on the decks of the Charity Commissioner's boat when it makes its semi-weekly trip to the city cemetery. Jacob Riis.
How the Other Half Lives awakened New Yorkers to the condition of the poor, as nothing else had. It was a new way of seeing the world, a modern way, and Riis used it not only to underscore his outrage, but to spur people to action. The slums were not inevitable, he insisted. They had been built by men and women, and men and women could change them.
One of the things that Riis is trying to do in this book, I think, is to get away from some of the older Victorian notions of poverty. Why are some people poor? Why do some people live in such terrible conditions? And his answer is more along the lines of a modern sort of environmental view of poverty. What he's basically arguing is that If people are going to live in these terrible tenements, if people are going to be deprived of the basics of light and air and decency, we can't be surprised if these people become criminals or depraved or alcoholics or what have you. So that there's a way in which Reese is, I think, the opening shot, if you will, or the first chapter in a Reformed tradition. Because it was a book that made a lot of people want to get involved in improving life in the city.
Not long after the book was published, New York's energetic young civil service commissioner, Theodore Roosevelt, called on Reese at his office on Printing House Square. The writer was out, but Roosevelt left his calling card with a note on the back. "I have read your book," it said, "and I have come to help."
New York, on the one hand, is a place where free market capitalism has been given its widest latitude. And yet, it's also the place where the consequences of that system have been called most sharply into question and efforts made to rein it in. I think New Yorkers have taken the lead in proposing an alternative social logic, a different ethical calculus, one that says that New Yorkers are entitled to certain things, whether or not they can afford to pay for them, by virtue of being New Yorkers. And that includes pure water, it includes public health, it includes affordable housing, education at a variety of levels, civil liberties, religious liberties. It says that social justice is a commensurate good with the accumulation of private profit.
The shapes arise. Shapes of factories, arsenals, foundries, markets.
In January 1892, Walt Whitman, now the most celebrated poet in the country, sent an announcement to the New York Herald, notifying his readers that Leaves of Grass, the book of poems he had lovingly rewritten for almost 40 years, was now complete. 2 months later, on March 26, 1892, the most visionary poet the city had ever seen died. "I bequeath myself to the dirt, to grow from the grass I love," he wrote, in lines that were written on his grave. "If you want me again, look for me under your boot soles."
I did feel there was a tingling beneath this huge city of ours, a restlessness that promised we knew not what. We could literally see New York expanding, growing, reaching out. Charles Hanson Town.
By 1892, the city Whitman had loved so deeply and imagined so vividly in advance had spread its wings far wider than even he could have imagined. The transformation from merchant city to industrial metropolis, sparked by Alexander Hamilton 100 years before, was all but complete. The city now sprawled, as DeWitt Clinton had predicted, almost the whole length of Manhattan Island. On Wall Street, money was flowing in as never before, as the frenzy of corporate mergers begun by J.P. Morgan 20 years before began to accelerate. And even greater changes lay in store, as New Yorkers now tried to prove they could do something more than just make money.
And with all the money that was converging, and with all the creative ecology of the city, many people began realizing that they had to do more than just stand by and watch. So it became one of the great founding times in our whole country for some of our most important, admirable, and long-lasting public institutions.
In little more than 10 years, an astonishing array of cultural institutions would be brought into existence in New York, or vastly expanded, including the immense Cathedral of St. John the Divine, Madison Square Garden and Carnegie Hall, the American Museum of Natural History, and the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And at the very heart of the city, on the site of the old Croton Reservoir at 42nd Street and 5th Avenue, the New York Public Library. The rage of Wall Street is to convert all baser things into gold, one curator said. But ours is the higher ambition, to convert your useless gold into things of living beauty that shall be a joy to a whole people for 1,000 years. Old New York has been torn down, and our critic wrote, as the century came to a close, and another city has arisen on its site.
It was an extraordinary time. There was this extraordinary amount of wealth, and also this notion that one had an obligation to use part of one's wealth to help everybody and to glorify your own city. All of our museums were built with private money. I mean, the Natural History Museum, the Metropolitan, the Modern, the Whitney, the Guggenheim. You know, the glories of London and Paris are paid for by the British nation or the French nation. The glories of New York have been paid for by New Yorkers.
It was critical for a city like ours, the greatest city in the country, but also the city which had to turn immigrants into Americans overnight as fast as we could, to give them not only give them a sense of awe, what did they come to from that little Sicilian hill town or a miserable little Irish village somewhere? And this was theirs. They went into these lobbies, they went into these great pillared buildings, and it was thrilling for them and something that they could identify with. What kind of building are you going to give the people to give them reassurance, to make them feel that something is stable when plainly nothing else is stable in the world?
What London is to the continent, what Rome in its imperial day was to the empire, New York is to the immense domain of the American Republic. A natural stage for the great drama of civilization on this continent. Henry Clews.
There was one last consolidation to come. For 250 years, New York City had been confined to the slender island of Manhattan. Now, on the very threshold of the new century, 100 years of unprecedented growth and extraterritorial ambition came to a stunning climax. At the stroke of midnight, on January 1st, 1898, after 3 decades of intense political maneuver by business leaders, city planners, and Republican politicians, the city suddenly threw back its borders and dramatically expanded its domain, annexing Brooklyn, itself the 3rd largest city in America, along with 38 villages in Queens, Staten Island, and the Bronx, to create a gigantic 5-borough metropolis, now called Greater New York.
Well, I think in retrospect, it's amazing that consolidation ever happened. Indeed, there is no parallel to the consolidation of New York in 1898 anywhere in the world. Buda and Pest come together, that's a kind of a thing, but it's much smaller than in New York. Chicago annexes the South Side. But in every one of those cases, it's really a much smaller, less significant place that's being added. The idea that a giant city like Brooklyn, let alone the big areas in the Bronx and Queens and Staten Island, should all come together in one enormous city, that's hard to get our minds around at the end of the 20th century, let alone in the 19th century.
As midnight approached on December 31st, 1897, 100,000 people crowded into City Hall Park in a pouring rain for the biggest celebration the city had ever seen. It was, the Tribune said, the biggest, noisiest, and most hilarious New Year's Eve celebration that Manhattan Island had ever known.
With the crash of cannon and the roar of exploding bombs, the flag of Greater New York was officially unfurled over City Hall at midnight, and the second city of the world came into existence, the New York Times.
Manhattanites had voted enthusiastically for the idea. So had the sparsely populated communities in outlying areas of Queens, Staten Island, and the Bronx, which stood to gain enormously in city services by consolidating with Manhattan. Only Brooklyn had held out, fiercely proud of its independence and mistrustful of the crowded immigrant city just across the river. In the end, consolidation won there by only 277 votes out of more than 129,000 cast.
In truth, Brooklyn and New York were combined long before consolidation in 1898. They were combined economically, they were combined socially, they were combined religiously. From the early 19th century, Manhattanites regularly crossed the East River, even before there was a bridge, when you had to take the old ferry system, to hear lectures in Brooklyn and to visit Brooklyn's great ministers. And so the two cities were culturally and economically tied long before consolidation, but there is a sense of regret that sweeps Brooklyn right after consolidation, because the city of Brooklyn is no more.
I remember there were old-timers around when I was a kid, who would mutter about it. The 1898 mistake, they called it. And so they forced this thing through the legislature, this Greater New York plan. And the people of Brooklyn were so angry with this that they promptly turned Democrat and have voted Democrat ever since. I don't think they voted Republican, and maybe for Eisenhower, but for virtually nobody else ever since.
But whether they liked it or not, New Yorkers had, with the stroke of a pen, turned their city into the second largest metropolis in the world. It now encompassed 327 square miles and over 3.5 million people, more than twice the size of Chicago, its closest American rival. It was now bigger than Berlin, Paris, and Moscow, bigger than any city in the world, except London. And, at the rate it was now growing, London itself would soon be eclipsed.
Well, consolidation was like a magic event for New York. Probably many of the things that did happen after 1900 in terms of the physical expansion of the city would have happened anyhow, but I think consolidation made it all easy and logical and almost a kind of manifest destiny for the city.
The banners were struck, the crowds went home, and the next day, everyone went back to business. Out in the harbor, ships moved back and forth across the bay. Freighters, loaded with raw materials and manufactured goods, bound for every port in the world. Barges filled with oil and coal. And big ocean-going steamships, packed to the rails with passengers, businessmen returning from abroad, and thousands upon thousands of immigrants. By 1898, a new immigration, far larger than the tide of Irish and Germans 50 years before, had long since overtaken the old. The start of the greatest movement of peoples in world history, it would soon swell to a flood of inconceivable proportions, bringing new people from new places, and challenging New York as never before to make a home for all its people.
This alien flood is the poorest, the most vicious, the most wholly undesirable peoples that have ever come to American shores. The Wall Street Journal.
The entrance into our political, social, and industrial life of such vast masses of peasantry, degraded below our utmost conceptions, is a matter which no intelligent patriot can look upon without the gravest alarm. These people have none of the inherited instincts which made it comparatively easy to deal with immigration in olden times. They are beaten men from beaten races, representative of the worst failures in the struggle for existence. Professor Francis Walker, Yale University.
The floodgates are open.
The dam is washed away. The sewer is unchoked. Europe is vomiting.
Visit New York online. Jump into a taxi and play a quiz game. Visit a virtual New York. And for teachers and parents, take your kids on a learning adventure through your town. PBS Online at pbs.org.
The city presents in microcosm all the contrasts of our modern life, its worst and its best aspects. Here are the broad avenues, and here the fetid streets whose festering filth pollutes the atmosphere. Here, palaces, on which self-extravagance has lavished every artifice for luxury and display. And here, tenements, where in defiance of every law, moral and sanitary, men, women and children are crowded together like maggots in a cheese. Here are the noblest men and women, putting forth the most consecrated energies in self-sacrificing labors for the redemption of their fellow men. Appalled, but not discouraged by the immensity of the problem which confronts them. And here, the most hopeless specimens of degraded humanity, in whom, so far as human sight can see, the last spark of divinity has been quenched forever. What shall we do? with our great cities? What will our great cities do with us? These are the two problems which confront every thoughtful American. The Reverend Lyman Abbott, Plymouth Church, Brooklyn, New York.
When one is inclined to despair of the country, let him go to the Central Park on a Saturday and spend a few hours there looking at the people, not those who come in gorgeous carriages, but those who arrive on foot or in those exceedingly democratic conveyances, the streetcars. New York Herald.
In the summer of 1865, as 4 long years of civil war came to an end, Frederick Law Olmsted returned to New York and resumed work on the Great Park he had begun 8 years before. One of his first acts was to commission a special memorial to the Union naval dead. 8 years later, the statue was complete. Rising above the Bethesda Fountain, at the very heart of the park, and the restless city already growing up around it, the artist had set a simple bronze figure, the Angel of the Waters, drawn from the Gospel of St. John, symbol of the healing power of nature.
I think that angel is the most beautiful angel on earth. I mean, it is a very American angel. I think she has a very homespun quality. Her dress is not completely full length. It sort of stops at her ankles. In fact, I think Emma Stebbins, the woman who sculpted her, got a lot of bad reviews when the statue was unveiled because critics, who are always wrong about everything, said, "Oh, she looks like a milkmaid." And this is not a grand, beautiful angel. This is a kind of a lumpy peasant girl angel. And I think that that's true to a certain extent, and part of what makes her exquisite. I love this gesture, as if she's reaching out and touching something incredibly specific and incredibly precious and within reach.
Ordinary New Yorkers took to the angel at once. In the years to come, Central Park would finally become the great Democratic meeting ground Olmsted and Vox had always dreamed of, if not always in ways they had envisioned, as new elevated railways soon brought poor New Yorkers, as well as rich, up on weekends, and carried the city itself northward, in new residential districts that soon flanked the park. Less than a decade after the war, more than 8.5 million people a year were escaping the noise and tumult of the city streets and plunging into Central Park, which had become, the New York Times declared, a majestic breathing space for the life of the city.
Here are all classes, represented with common purpose, competitive with none, disposing of jealousy toward none, each adding by his mere presence to the pleasure of all the others. You may often see vast numbers of persons brought closely together, poor and rich, young and old, Jew and Gentile. Is it doubtful that it does men good to come together in this way, in pure air and under the light of heaven? Frederick Law Olmsted.
It's an amazing thing to go there on an afternoon and see people of all classes and races in this public square, this great public square, which is what it is, mingling and having fun and relaxing together. That just the experience of doing things together like that creates a common bond, a common identity, a common sense of the city.
Central Park is really the thing that makes life in New York possible. New York's not a practical proposition without Central Park, and I think that you get that sense of juxtaposition, that you're really in a wild place. And then you can look around you, and you're completely surrounded by skyscrapers, office buildings, and no other city in the world, I don't think, would allow that much of the most expensive acreage in the world to remain parkland.
Inscribed in Central Park was an extraordinary vision of what a great democratic city could be. Yet, beyond its borders, tremendous tensions and conflicts remained. By 1870, the park itself had become deeply embroiled in a bitter debate over who controlled the city's future: middle-class reformers, robber barons and financiers, Tammany Hall officials, or the people themselves. In the decades to come, as the forces unleashed by the Civil War brought a stunning new scale to the city and country, New York would become one of the most eerily divided places on earth, caught between an insatiable greed for money and wealth, and a yearning for something higher.
The second half of the 19th century, or the decades after the Civil War, do witness major change in the city. First of all, it becomes a true metropolis. It has 1 million people by 1860 and 5 million by the end of the century. So the sheer size of the city now is world class. So the problems it's encountering in terms of disease, in terms of police protection, in terms of fire, it's encountering these really as soon as any other city on the planet.
Between 1865 and 1898, New York would become home to the greatest concentration of wealth in human history. It would also become home to the greatest concentration of poverty, and to the greatest divisions of rich and poor. Not one city, but two. One dazzling and one benighted. One prosperous and one poor. One city of sunshine and another of shadow.
There was appalling misery in New York. Terrible crowding, terrible slums, all kinds of disease, crime, prostitution, children sleeping in the streets, children begging in the streets. It was crowded, it was dirty, it smelled terrible, much of it. Traffic was worse than it is today, if that's possible to imagine.
I think that we've tended to forget, or we've perhaps ignored or not paid enough attention to, how desperate life was for so many hundreds of thousands, millions of people in New York in this period. I think that an enormous number of people, especially people living in tenements, lived in life-threatening situations. Poverty in those days was conceived as something that was a personal problem. If you were poor, the reason probably has something to do with some character flaw, something that was wrong with you.
The opportunity to attain great wealth is within the reach of almost every man and woman. Let us remember, there is not a poor person in the United States who was not made poor by his own shortcomings. It is all wrong to be poor, anyhow. The Reverend Russell H. Conwell.
Before the 19th century came to an end, New Yorkers would be forced to face the most perplexing conundrum of the industrial age. Where material progress is most fully realized, one reformer wrote in despair, there we find the deepest poverty.
Pre-Civil War New York was provincial. Pre-Civil War New York was a place that the Dickenses and the Mrs. Trollops and so forth came, and Trollope himself came to see, how the natives disported themselves. Pre-Civil War New York was still an English province in an amazingly basic way. Post-Civil War New York, New York was New York. New York was America. New York was the representation to the world and to itself of what America was like, what's difference to the power and might of America.
Between the end of the Civil War and the start of World War I, great new wealth was created in the city of unprecedented scale. But it wasn't just that there was great wealth. What's so important to understand, too, is that the wealth was being created by new ideas, new processes, a whole new kind of America. With the telegraph, with the advent of cheap steel, with the discovery of oil. And this new money coming from new ways of making money was creating a new city in New York, because it was the point at which all these curves, all these traffic patterns were converging.
More than any place else in America, New York City had won the Civil War. Supercharged by the demands of the 4-year-long struggle, the city's industrial machine had simply exploded, making New York the undisputed financial clearinghouse of the nation and the richest city in America. The New York Stock Exchange, operating out of its mammoth new headquarters at Broad Street and Wall, was soon trading more than $3.5 billion a year. The light of Mammon, one visitor reported, gleams on every face in Broadway and Wall Street.
The Civil War in America marks the watershed between the mercantile world or an agricultural world and capitalism, the industrial age. The industrial age in a big way, the age of machines, the age where fortunes are made by dominating a natural product. You define the fortunes of people in New York after the Civil War in terms of a resource, oil, coal, or something that also needs huge capitals, something like a railroad.
As the age of ships gave way to the age of rail and steam, 75-year-old Cornelius Vanderbilt sold his vast shipping empire and reinvested in railroads, ruthlessly consolidating 17 smaller lines to form a single giant system, the New York Central. An eccentric autocrat, utterly indifferent to public opinion, Vanderbilt traveled everywhere he could in his own crimson and gold railroad car, routinely terrorized his competitors, and rarely gave to charity, on principle. Let others do what I have done, he said, and they need not be around here begging.
New York City was based upon greed and based upon making money. Cornelius Vanderbilt, the Commodore, what a wonderful pirate he was. He never had a thought in his head except to make money.
A strange craziness is abroad in the land. Some mysterious spirit of evil has led our people into the blindest, wildest infatuation, wild and foolish speculation. At least half the people are living beyond their means. The Round Table, 1866.
Wall Street exploded in a frenzy of reckless, unregulated, and often unprincipled speculation.
There were no rules. All bets were off. You could do whatever you want. So people made the most outrageous efforts at basically boarding and seizing corporations and using them as playthings. You know, printing stock secretly in a basement and selling it to people until it was worthless. Rigging the market, trying to buy up all the silver and all the gold. It was an attempt to corner the nation's gold supply and then be in a position to make enormous profits that had zero ethical basis and zero fallout for the larger economy.
In 1869, a dapper but corrupt financial genius named Jay Gould and his partner, Jim Fisk, a flamboyant financier and ladies' man, tried to corner the market in gold, using money they had personally embezzled from the stockholders of the Erie Railroad.
The genuine aristocracy of the city stands stunned and helpless under the new order of things. They find themselves supplanted by upstart princes of shoddy. They move into remote new streets uptown and talk feelingly of the crash which is to come when the props are knocked from under this flimsy edifice of prosperity. Mark Twain.
The thinkers of America, the intellectuals of America, uniformly were in despair at that moment. They were saying that America had taken a wrong turn and that we had saved the Union, but the Union had then really been given to the carpetbaggers, to the people who had, the new rich, who had made money out of the Civil War, enormous fortunes being made out of the Civil War. And these new people were not the people that our thinkers had hoped were going to emerge from this fratricidal, monstrous thing, instead of which it was vulgar and aggressive, and it was Jim Fisk, it was Gould, it was the worst elements who would suddenly come to the top.
And still the boom went on. Powered by the surge of investment on Wall Street, the same steam and steel revolution unifying the continent now began transforming the city itself. In less than a decade, 4 elevated railroad lines stretched the length of the island, and the Upper East Side and Upper West Side had exploded in a frenzy of construction, as block after block was filled with working-class tenements and middle-class row houses. Once, transit lines had followed patterns of growth. Now they helped create them. Put the road there, Commodore Vanderbilt declared, and people will go there to live. Year after year, isolated farmland in the far-flung Bronx, along with hamlets in Queens and Staten Island, began to be pulled into the orbit of the rapidly growing metropolis.
It's the absolute size of New York which becomes so impressive in the second half of the 19th century. The southern part of the Bronx, which was then part of Westchester County, so that the Bronx is beginning to explode in population. All of Upper Manhattan, that area around Central Park, which was empty at the time of the Civil War. By 1900, it's all filled up. Brooklyn, for example, expands from being what is arguably the first suburb in the world, or certainly in the United States, until by the end of the century, it's the third largest city in the United States. That's an incredible growth.
March 18th, 1865. Crossed at Wall Street Ferry and explored sundry new districts in Brooklyn. I hereby prophesy that in 1900 AD, Brooklyn will be the city and New York will be the suburb. It is inevitable that both go on growing as they have grown in the last 40 years. Brooklyn has room to spread, and New York has not. George Templeton Strong.
Year after year, New York hurtled blindly into the future, with scarcely a thought for what was being left behind. For more than 200 years, a venerable pear tree had stood at the corner of 3rd Avenue and 13th Street, where Peter Stuyvesant himself had planted it back in 1667. Now, in the winter of 1867, the coldest in living memory, the battle-scarred veteran of innumerable encounters with the lorries and wagons of lower Manhattan succumbed to the ravages of time and the weather and was pulled down. The last living connection to the old Dutch settlement was gone.
New York is notoriously the largest and least loved of any of our great cities. Why should it be loved as a city? It is never the same city for a dozen years altogether. A man born 40 years ago finds nothing, absolutely nothing, of the New York he knew. If he chances to stumble upon a few old houses not yet leveled, he is fortunate. But the landmarks, the objects which marked the city to him as a city, are gone. Harper's Monthly.
On the morning of January 23rd, 1867, the citizens of New York and Brooklyn awoke to an extraordinary sight. The East River had frozen over solid, locking the ferries in ice, bringing traffic in the harbor to a standstill, and crippling commerce between the two cities for weeks. For years, people had been dreaming of a structure that could span the turbulent river, a gigantic bridge that would unite the two cities and free transportation from the tyranny of the weather. Now something, everyone agreed, had to be done. Before the ice had thawed that spring, the New York Bridge Company had been incorporated and charged with the task of finding someone capable of building such a structure.
They built the bridge because they saw New York City running out of space. Manhattan Island was finite. There was just so much of it, and it was filling up fast. But Brooklyn, it seemed, could expand endlessly out onto Long Island. Therefore, the bridge was built not to get to New York, but to get to Brooklyn. And it was seen as a way of having the city expand into that open space of Brooklyn, because nobody had yet imagined a city growing upward instead of out.
The very thing that made the bridge so crucial made it all but impossible to build. The East